Knights at the Round Table, a round-table discussion on speculative fiction books and film. Cool! Hi everybody, and welcome to the first episode of Season 6 of Knights at the Round Table. Today, for the first episode, we are discussing The 100,000 Kingdoms, the first book in the Inheritance trilogy by N.K. Jeminsin. I am sitting at the table here with Nathan and with Gloria, and I'd like to start with general impressions of the book. So Gloria, since you're new, you get to go first. Hot seat.
I really enjoyed it. I will confess I'm a big N.K. Jeminsin fan, so I feel like I was going into the book knowing I was going to enjoy it a lot. I will say I didn't like it as much as the other trilogies that she wrote, the Broken Earth trilogy, but that was just an amazing trilogy that would be very difficult to live up to. So as in earlier works, though, I really still really enjoyed how she would play on some of the sort of science fiction and fantasy themes that you often see, but like putting in her own, perspective of it. Anyway, that's what I'll say for my initial impressions.
Okay, excellent. Nate.
I absolutely adored this book. I'm the one who put it in the hat.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I read this on Audible actually a couple of years ago, and it was the first book I'd ever read by N.K. Jeminsin, and it just blew my mind. It was so good. It's one of those books that I would stay in the car when I was parked just to finish my chapter and maybe listen to one more chapter.
Go for longer drives.
Yeah,
milk. Milk and Kempville?
I'll go!
This is my first N.K. Jeminsin book, and I really liked it a lot. As far as fantasy books go, it's nice to see such a diverse cast, and it's... So here's the thing. Political stuff and first-person perspective usually aren't my jam. But somehow, she made it so that when I started reading, I could not stop. I finished this book just sitting down in a day, from 12 o'clock until 4 o'clock.
That's how you know it's good.
That's how you know it's good. I did not require any distractions. Sometimes when I'm reading a book for this panel, so I'm like, I'm getting a little bit bored, I'll jump on Twitter for a second. But that did not happen with this book. From page 1 all the way to the end, I was just nose deep in it. It was great.
Well, that's how you know it's a good book, right? When it really just pulls you in and you don't want to put it down, right?
Yeah.
I wish I felt that way about my textbooks, but...
Yeah.
Hope my professors don't watch these.
Yeah, this is why you study what you like, folks.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I loved that the protagonist was dark-skinned, didn't consider herself particularly pretty, and didn't seem to be considered by others particularly pretty. I love the Dari culture, by the way.
Yeah, matriarchal culture of
Matriarchal
women warriors.
culture. Yeah, right?
Yeah.
And it's the men who stay home to defend, the children, because, they've got greater body strength, so they're clearly the last line of defense, not the first.
And it's interesting you bring that up because I saw that as a really interesting theme that she kept bringing up in there. Your typical binaries that you would assume to be good or bad, she kind of flips that, right?
She does, yeah. The Night Lord is not this evil thing.
Yeah.
No,
he's very complex.
He's awesome, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Exactly.
Yes, as far as characters go, I think he might be my favorite.
And the whole city of Sky, or the Palace of Sky, is, you would, in a normal sci-fi thing, you would think it would be the ruling class that would be good. And there's all these imagery that she puts in there, associating with white walls and light and all these things that you would normally associate with good. But then you start to see how that power is really corrupted, and that's a particular image that they may portray of themselves as being the rightful rulers that are keeping order and peace.
With white and light, but it's peace at any cost, and that's not necessarily a good thing. And
really, you have the that dichotomy of light and dark and everything, and she did a really good job of exploring imperialism, and how. The ruling society will always impose the narrative that they are good and they are generous and they are just, bringing civilization to these poor other communities. And then when you get into it, you see that, no, they just want all the things for themselves. And that's
it's propaganda.
Yeah, it's classical colonial propaganda.
Yeah. And see, that's what I really respect about Jeminsin, because as You know, I read, like, I mean, I'm not saying she's the first one to do this, but a lot of sci-fi and fantasy storylines have this, like, view of a colonizer, as in they're exploring these new worlds and what are these great accomplishments that man is going to make. But this one kind of flips that a little bit, because it's from the point of view of the colonized.
Yeah.
Well, actually, she's interesting because she's kind of from both worlds, technically speaking, so that's a really interesting perspective.
Yeah, I like how she sort of tries to dance between them, too.
Yeah.
Like, at one stage, when some poor guy is being turned into Black Diamond, she's like, I am Arameri. I'm not going to freak out about this. I am Arameri. And then at the end,
also, I hate them.
Yeah. But then at the end, she's like, I am not Arameri.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, for me, as a person from an immigrant family background, I really actually, not that I personally relate to, like, the sort of more concrete aspects of that. I've never, dealt with magic and that sort of thing, but I do understand
you don't have a psychotic grandfather.
Yeah, exactly. Well, my family's very interesting, but not quite at that level. But, it's interesting because I think that a lot of people can relate to being part of two different cultures. It doesn't even have to be a racial culture, but just if you're used to being from two different worlds and having to juggle that, I feel like that really would speak a lot to folks dealing with that sort of situation.
Yeah,
definitely. And the main character has a really conflicted relationship with these two worlds, because, like, her mother left that world for a reason and then was assassinated, and she's also looking for her mother's killer. Like, she came to the city. Well, first of all, the general plot is, like, she's invited as a potential heir because the old emperor person is dying.
Crazy grandfather
is dying, and she's one of the potential heirs, but it turns out that she was only invited there as, like, a farce. And then she really only goes so that she can find out who killed her mother and why. And so she has all that relationship with this family of, like, well, they're the horrible people who murdered my mother, probably.
And then sort of the dichotomy between the two mothers, like the one that she knew, that she grew up with, who was loving and warm and could be, like, pretty, like, brutal and uptight when she had to be, but was otherwise just your regular mum. And then this woman that they keep talking about, who is absolutely as ruthless, if not more so, than her grandfather, and played the political game, and
was good at it.
Yeah. She was a viper, like Queen Viper in the Viper's Nest, essentially. Yeah.
When I first started, when I read the back of the book, I was like, this sounds like one of those, like, classic rags to riches sort of, like, Cinderella story. But it's not. Again, that's what I really like about Jeminsin. She always, like, flips that, right? Like, because the part that you're talking about, how she gets invited to the palace and she's all of a sudden finds out she's going to be potentially the heir. That's, like, a very classic. I really liked The Princess Bride. No, The Princess Diaries as a kid, right? It's all about, like, I find out I'm royalty now. But, like, she doesn't go that particular route, right? Because she, first of all, she was a ruler of her own smaller nation. And, like, then, like you were describing, it turns out she's a pawn in this larger Game of Thrones like political game, but then she manages to retain her own agency by having her own sort of agenda in there.
Yeah,
like,
exactly. Because she came here to find out what happened to her mother. She came here to, like, also represent her people, because they're being shafted by this huge empire, and they have no voice. And she's like, well, if I'm a member of this family, maybe I can bring their interests before. And it turns out, like, when she finds out about the empire and everything that she could have and everything that they're doing, she decides, like, no, they should be burned down to the ground.
Essentially,
yeah.
Or, buried beneath a giant earth tree.
That too.
Yeah.
I really liked that imagery.
Yeah. And that it continues on in the rest of this trilogy too. So it's it's a great first book for that trilogy.
Yeah, I like the idea, the way she's portrayed the gods. I'm also kind of mad about it because this book series I'm working on has something quite similar, and I'm really angry.
She stole it.
Damn it. But I liked the idea that there was dark, and then there was light, and then there was the force in between, which was life, and how it's represented by these three sibling / lovers, deities.
Yeah.
The rules are different. And
it's classic mythology, though.
Yes, it is.
Except that I like there's a lot of queer, like the gods are queer and
polyamorous.
Because there's two, like, kind of more traditional male entities and one more traditional, like, female entities, but they're all lovers.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. And then the whole mess started because
they were all in love with each other and jealous of each other.
Yeah. Well, wasn't it like the Lord of Light?
He was jealous.
Who was the most jealous and just decided that he would off Enfa so that he could have the Night Lord to himself.
Yeah, and there's another like dichotomy where you usually have like, oh well, he's the Lord of the Darkness, so he's evil, and he's the Lord of Light, so he's no. There's no like good and evil. There's just people.
And the stories that they tell them, or stories or lies that they might tell.
Yeah, like the religious propaganda about the what was Lord? I just want to say Lord of Light, but that's not his name.
The Dayfather?
The Dayfather. Thank you.
Maybe I'm not
Skyfather.
Sure. Skyfather. There you go.
Skyfather.
Yeah.
Ha! Skyfather.
I mean, there was one scene in there where they're talking about like going for the proper like bureaucratic processes to declare a war, and I thought that's it's sort of like classic portrayal where she's trying to show how this facade of like rationality is that doesn't necessarily mean that you've got like a just situation, right? Like because war is still horrible and violent, but they're like, as long as you follow the proper procedure and fill out the paperwork for it, then it's okay, right? Yeah. Oh, it's really interesting. It's
not that different from the way war is waged these days either.
Yeah, we've got special rules for how you're supposed to treat your prisoners and stuff like that. But is that any of that like really actually okay?
Yeah, no, right? Exactly. None of it's okay.
Yeah.
But I think like in the US, for example, don't you have to have one of the branches of government's approval?
Yeah,
like it has to be
there's certain procedures that have to be followed.
Certain procedures that must be followed before you can declare war. It's the same sort of thing.
Yeah. It's interesting. But like one of the things I was mentioning about how like I like the way she portrays the gods as just being sort of extensions of humans. Like I sat there thinking like, are they metaphors? What are they exactly? And I never really came to a conclusion of it. But I just really like the way she portrays. Actually, she in her other books as well. She portrays like queer relationships as being just a normal way that the society runs. Like, and that's what I really like because in a certain sense it is a bit of a utopian fantasy where that actual particular aspect is not a big deal. Nobody seems to care that you've got she's got some characters in her other books that are trios. They're like in a relationship of 3 and it just passes it off. It's not particularly progressive or new or anything like that. That's just how things are. How it is. Nobody minds,
Yeah. Well, that's nice. What a world.
One of my favorite things is I've mentioned it already, but is how she really goes in depth and portrays people who are deeply flawed as still lovable people. Like the Night Lord, like he's very complicated as a person, and he definitely has like massive flaws, but also he has really good things about him, and the character loves him deeply. Like the main character, learns to not learns, but she falls in love with him.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not that difficult to do if you're into the brooding type.
Okay, so let's talk about that for a second here. All of the like god sex, like
yeah.
Okay, the one thing I wasn't super passionate about the book was there were certain parts of the god sex scenes where I was like, okay, this is at least described better than Twilight. But, the kind of people that would really enjoy those scenes in Twilight would probably also enjoy those aspects as well.
Honestly, I don't mind sex scenes if they're done well, and they weren't done poorly here. So
no, they were very sexy. Yeah. They were very sexy.
Particularly the big one at the end.
Oh, yeah.
With the ruined bed. I'll just leave it at that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's not that I'm not into it, but I was like, oh man, she's really inserting a lot of sex with gods here. I guess that's it. It's an essential part of the plot, but she doesn't do that as much with the other series that she did. So.
Yeah.
So if you like Twilight, you will also like this, but if you hate Twilight, you will also still like this book. Just like portions of it.
Read this book.
Exactly.
Oh dear me. Okay, I liked the idea of I can't pronounce her name. Yane? How would you pronounce her name?
Yane.
Oh, I was close!
Yeah.
I listened to it on Audible.
I really liked Yane's ascension into godhood. And I liked that she didn't have to lose herself in order to do it. And because I'm a huge fan of the mythology of the dying god. In this case, it's the dying goddess. And that because she did create life, and then the flip side of creation is destruction. So you can't have life without death or death without life. So it fit for me that this goddess would die only to be reborn as another goddess. kind of idea.
And in the whole process, like you mentioned, she doesn't the main character doesn't actually lose herself because she's still, like, her soul is still there. I don't remember exactly what the arrangement was, but she doesn't lose herself, and it's the reason the fact that her
souls.
Exactly, and the fact that her soul was fighting to stop the goddess's soul from consuming it. I think that really just shows how the author was really trying to show how the main character, despite these like political entanglements that she was stuck in, still had a sense of agency and still like was able to have what her accomplishments mean something, you know, like it's she manages to build a strong character even though there's all these like fates and political intrigue where she's like caught in the web of all sorts of stuff she's not aware of, you know.
There's a lot of exploration of the like relationship between power and agency in this book, and one of the things that really got to me was how she portrayed the enslaved gods, because they're gods, they're enslaved, but they're gods, so they're not. They may be enslaved. That doesn't mean they're not powerful, and they're not enslaved because they lack agency or power or anything. It's a circumstance that, you know, they're kind of trapped in, and you know, they don't like take back their power. Like they've always been powerful, and they've always been people full of agency who now have the opportunity to just, you know, take back what they had.
Yeah. How did you feel about the betrayal twist?
With the goddess of wisdom, you mean?
Yeah.
That one?
I felt like I have a lot of feelings about this. My main feeling is it was a really good exploration of agency, and she chose her agency to, like, a lot of people give up their freedom for safety, and I think that was what this was about. Like, she didn't want things to change because she wasn't sure what things might look like if they changed, and so...
Or see, I took it that she was so desperate for freedom that she would have it under any terms.
That too.
At the expense of the other gods.
At the expense of the other gods,
And I think there's a lot of... I'm not the person to talk about it, and I think none of us are, but I think there's a lot of parallels to, like, you know, obviously slavery in the United States.
Yes.
And what does it mean that she was the goddess of wisdom, right? Like, so presumably she's going to be wiser than others, and that's the choice that she made. Does that mean that everyone who stayed loyal is not? That wasn't a smart move? I mean, they ended up winning, right? So, like, I thought that was interesting that they had... I'm correct, right? It was the goddess of wisdom that had ended up...
Yes, it was. Yeah.
But see, wisdom sometimes is choosing the safer path, and the safer path is often the status quo.
That's so interesting, because so that would suggest that bravery, which is what sometimes is required to win, doesn't always mean staying within like the rational sort of
Absolutely
sense.
not. When you're being brave, often you take a huge risk, and the risk is often worth it. And it doesn't mean the risk shouldn't be taken, but often like the wise or safe course of action is just let things go.
That's interesting. I didn't think about that, but it's true. It's not just all
well,
about...
then it brings the question of what is actual wisdom, right?
That's a good point.
But also
don't look
that
at me
wisdom and courage are not necessarily, you know, one and the same, and don't necessarily go hand in hand. And that wisdom is not like, you know, better than courage. It's just a different thing.
That's true.
Yeah, that's true.
And then going back to what you were saying about agency, I thought it was really interesting how throughout the whole book, she's basically just trying to assert her own will, and despite the fact that she's struggling against all these forces that are working against her. So when she finds out that she's carrying the soul of this goddess, and also her grandfather's going to kill her in 7 days, and there's like this one moment where she's just like, everybody is just betraying me. This is just crazy. And then that's when she like could have gone this way or that way, submitted to the grandfather's will or the god's will, and she's like, you know what? Looks like I'm gonna die anyway, so I'm gonna choose this, and I'm gonna put in my own demands, because she says, well, I'll do this, but you have to let me win this contest, right?
Yeah.
And that's where she's like saying, okay, well, these are like these terrible choices that I have, but it's gonna be on my own terms, which I don't know, I really find that stuff really inspiring.
Yeah.
I
also liked how she thought the grandfather killed her mother.
Yeah.
And the grandfather thought she did, because she's one of them, right? And that's what they would do.
Communication, guys. So many family conflicts can be resolved if they just talk to each other. No.
I don't know that
Instead
that's
of playing
this
these
one.
stupid power games.
Oh God.
Yeah, that, to be fair, I don't have a grandfather that's the ruler of like 100,000 kingdoms, so
yeah, seriously.
Seems like a bit of a different situation.
Or that my fellow heirs are crazy.
I know,
Yeah.
right?
Oh,
What
my
did you make of
God.
the two cousins there?
Skimila and Relad.
Yeah.
Relad? I don't
Yeah,
know.
how do they pronounce it in the audiobooks? Relad or Relad, the cousin?
I don't remember. I think it's Relad.
Relad.
Yeah.
Is just a drunkard because he can't handle
Yeah.
how poisonous
Yeah, he can't
it is in
cope.
it.
Yeah.
He just can't cope. So
And
he's
he's the
drinking
one that has the most, like, humanity of all of them.
Right? Well, I mean,
It's his humanity that, like,
yeah, I would
makes
think
it so he can't cope with
exactly. I think if you did have anything even approaching empathy in
Mm.
that situation, you would be either hanging from the end of a rope or buried chin deep in pills.
And then you get Skimina who like sicks a god on her the first time they meet. And then I was like, how are you doing, cousin? You want to come over for lunch? Like, I just could not get over how, like, I think that's a certain culture that they're trying to portray of how, as long as you guys are saying it civilly, then whatever you do, like, doesn't matter how cruel you are, you just have to do it, you know, properly.
But also, like, you look at that, and it's kind of like an allegory for the way that we act in real life.
Absolutely.
Like, you know, you look at people, and you look at, for example, racism. And people who, you know, there's tons of people who will be really, really racist and do really, really racist things. And then, you know, pretend and just, like, act in public like, oh, I would never do
As long
that.
as
Oh,
you're saying it
it's
within the
fine.
confines of a rational discourse, then it's
Right.
like, you know, it's just free speech.
That's
Right?
it,
Yeah.
that's it.
No, I think that's exactly the kind of thing she's trying to portray with those scenes about what is the proper way to invade a kingdom, what is the, you know, on all those sort of discussions. And so you got the Sky Father, who is the god of peace and rationality and all that sort of stuff, but then you find out it still doesn't mean that, like, horrible things aren't happening. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
What did you guys think of the god Sia? How did we
Sia.
Sia.
Yeah.
He was an interesting
Oh
guy.
my God, he was my favorite.
fascinating.
He was my
I
favorite.
loved him. I also felt very maternal towards him.
Yeah,
like
me
halfway
too.
through meeting him,
Yeah.
I'm like, no, you're adorable.
Yeah, so he's a trickster god that's kind of portrayed as a child, and
But he's very old. That's the thing.
he's the oldest of them all, and he's, but, you know, he goes around looking like a kid, and people, you forget that he's not,
Yeah.
because he really behaves like it, and his behavior kind of really matches this trickster thing that he does.
But it turns out that he's literally the most helpful person.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rely on the trickster god this time around. He's not gonna screw you over. He's like the one person who won't. Yeah.
It's so interesting, this character, because I found it very unique. I'm sure there are other, like, fantasy novels that have that, but just this idea of a child that has the wisdom of, like, someone that's lived like that, like, known the history of all of humanity, but also still has the mind of a child, and, you know, the sort of, like, what do you call it? Like, the temperament of a child.
Yeah. And so it's that impulsiveness. And,
Yeah, exactly. Just
But also
going
big
for-
feelings.
Yeah, exactly. And it was really interesting, like, his feelings for the main character, because the main character is carrying the soul of his mother, and he just misses his mom.
Yeah.
Which is something that
which also made me just go, no.
I know.
No.
And it, you know, when you figure out that she has, like, the piece of soul and everything, everything makes so much more sense, because he's attached to her the minute she gets there.
Exactly, and you're like, that's weird. What
Yeah,
is
like,
this
why
about?
is he helping her? Like, what does he have to gain? And then you're like, oh.
He just missed his mom.
Yeah,
This is
that's
his
all.
mom.
Yeah.
Oh, that's yes. Okay. We're getting near the end of our half hour, so I'm going to have to start with final thoughts and star rating. Nate, what did you reckon?
So many things I could say about this book more. This was a solid 5 stars for me. I loved this book. You know, I hadn't read anything else by N.K. Jeminsin when I started, and this is her first novel. And when I found out it was her first novel, I was like, what? That is a solid first novel. It's a solid novel. I loved it.
Spectacular debut.
I struggle with, like, thinking about what rating I want to give it, because I can't read it out of context, and my problem is I read her later works first, and this is clearly her early works. A standalone, it's a fantastic novel, but she gets even better. You know,
I
she
know.
gets even better. So,
Yeah.
like, you know, so definitely, I'm glad that you're probably going to read it in the correct order that you should.
Yeah.
So, like, it's not as amazing as her later books, but as it stands alone, it was a really important novel that came out. It had a lot of, I think it really reflects what was going on in society at the time too, with, like, in our society with Black Lives Matter and all these conversations about race and gender. So I think it plays a really important role. So, and that's the only reason why I'm not giving it a 5 out of 5, because I know she gets even better than that. But I would probably give it a 4.5 out of 5 stars.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm gonna give it a 4. Mostly because I am not a huge fan of first-person perspective and political intrigue, although this really was more about the characters and the politics, so... And she gets past them. Yeah. God sex, specifically. That breaks the bed.
Exactly. That's what she retains of the whole book. Takeaway. Better than Twilight.
That's not...
That's not a high bar,
That's
though.
not a high bar.
I say this like I've read Twilight.
Oh, you haven't? Oh,
Yeah.
don't. Okay, so yeah, I really like this book. Absolutely solid. I understand all the praise that she's been getting. Another thing that I wanted to talk about, but didn't get the chance because we were so busy with like all the cool plot and character stuff, is she writes beautifully. It
Oh my God,
flows beautifully. It's a pleasure to read, and it's not purple prose like some people can get like super flowery, like, oh, that's really clever and beautiful. It's actually just, it flows beautifully and feels really comfortable to read, and is part of the reason why I think I dived so fully into this book. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not a very visual person. I like, even when I write, I don't visualize as much. When I read, I certainly don't see anything that I read. Like, it's all non-visual. And this is one of the rare novels that actually made me see things.
Yeah. Oh, it's just...
It's because
really
the
good.
description she gives is very, like, just concrete descriptions that make you visualize it. It's, yeah, she's a great writer.
Yeah. Pick up this book. Absolutely. I forgot to bring the ball out.
Oh, yeah, for next week. Or next time.
No, those are movies. Oh no, where are my list of films? Here. Nope.
How does that work if there's one piece of paper in there and I just draw the one?
There is.
Oh no, you could.
Yay! They put them in the wrong envelope.
Okay, perfect.
I was gonna, if there's only one thing to pick, that's an illusion of choice.
Yeah, I know. It's like what happened to
Yeah. Awesome. So I get to pick one?
You get to pick one.
This is the books or the novels? Oh, sorry, the books or the movies?
These are the books.
Okay.
So next month's book will be...
Exciting. Okay, it looks like we've got On Basilisk Station by David Weber.
Oh, so this is a sci-fi. I've not read this one either. But I
me
looked
neither.
into that David Weber.
Coffee!
My Little Pony coffee.
Thank you. Awesome.
Not just my shirt.
Just as we're ending. So thanks very much, guys. We'll take a break before we go on to episode 2. Until then, bye.
Bye.